so that you can hear me above the water boiler. Welcome all to our research seminar today. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you and introduce Joshua Finch with a few words and also the project. This is the eight months of this project. We started in June last summer and are looking very much forward to this coming growing season as well. Joshua has been working with us since the beginning of this project, and Joshua is he's always said that he's self-taught in this particular field, and that might be so, but it is a very long and big and vast knowledge that you have been able to build up all by yourself, which I think is admirable, and we will see a little glimpse of that here today. I hope that all of you also there behind your computers feel free to also add things in the chat. We have Heidi here who will keep an eye on the chat. And after Joshua has finished his presentation, there's time for questions as well. But without further ado, please welcome Joshua and take it away.
All right, well, thank you. So my praise. Without further ado. All right, well, welcome everyone. So I'm Joshua, and I'm the project leader for the Lill-Nägels Agroforestry Project. And today I would like to present the longest title you've ever seen for a presentation. I tried to put more words on the title slide, but Google refused. So in a nutshell, what we're going to look at is the seed of this project. What's the core of the project? The project expands well beyond the restoration of soil, but if we don't restore the soil on this particular site, we won't be able to do these other things we would like to do, which would be direct marketing involving the local customer base in the cultivation and the harvest of the crops. It all begins with the soil. And I have about 30 minutes. I think I recorded 35 minutes is what this is going to take. And then we'll have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. So I can't touch base with everything about this project, but it should provide enough of a basis to ask some questions. And if you're as nerdy as I am and you've looked at the website, you might have some questions because it's a very interesting project. So today's topics, I've broken down the talk into only 3 parts. We're going to, as briefly as possible, look at what the problem is. So what's going on with this site? Why are we doing something different? And what are we going to do about it? What's the solution set that we can take ideas from and apply them in this place? So in this place would be our project. So our project is our project. We have one site and we're working on that in context. So that's a word that'll come up quite a lot, is context. To give a little bit of context, here's some photos about last summer. So we started in June. It was beautiful in June, and then it became dry and it stayed dry. So unfortunately, I don't have the kind of photographic documentation of our project that I would have liked to have, but this is the reality of agriculture, right? So if you don't have irrigation and it doesn't rain, there isn't that much that you can do. So we'll be drawing on some photographs and things from other projects as well to sort of make the case. And that's actually quite useful. So what's the problem? Well, we have degraded, unproductive soil. But I think it's really useful to go back and give a little bit of historical context. This farm has been in production agriculture for over 300 years. These problems don't emerge overnight, and they're also not the desired outcome of the farmers. So in 2023, when most people aren't farming, sometimes it can become rather easy for us to look at the problems in agriculture and find somebody to blame, like who caused this problem. So I'd like to just take a step back and acknowledge that this place has produced food for the community for a very long time. And what we're trying to do is make sure that it can continue to do that and even produce more food perhaps than it ever has going into the future. Also, some management context. What kind of practices did lead to the degraded scenario? Well, none of these should be all of that novel for anybody. They are the usual suspects. They're not the usual suspects in the case that any one of these agricultural practices by itself causes soil degradation, or that they should never be used, but that when they're used in concert and not in balance with other practices and other ways of looking at the site, you do end up with degraded, unproductive soil in the long run. And these are just some of the outcomes that you can see with degraded soil, that you don't even need a laboratory test necessarily in order to see what's going on here. So all of these are evident on our site. And just to show that I don't think that these 5 points of agricultural practices should never be used, here's a GIF that I made because I didn't want the video of us doing some tillage, some recreational tillage at the site, and preparing the tree lines for cultivation. As I mentioned before, we have a perennial grassland here. Perennial grassland, even if it's not the healthiest grass possible, it's not going to like new friends joining it. It has its network, it has its roots, and we need to do something in order to get rid of it. But the point of putting this little video on here is to show what happens when you use tillage, when you have a loss of soil organic matter. So if the soil was healthy and we ran a few tillage passes on it, maybe there would be some wind erosion, but it wouldn't be this as dramatic. When we did this last tillage pass, it was, well, this is why we are trying to avoid these practices going into the future. And the last slide for the problem is just say that we're benchmarking this from a number of different angles. So I'm of the school of thought that if you can approach a problem from different perspectives, even if they're quite similar, the more that they overlap, the closer you are to ascertaining the truth of the situation. Because I could dig soil profiles, run water infiltration tests, and do similar on-farm studies of the soil and come to the conclusion that it's degraded. I can find the compaction layer, I can see where the problems are, I can see their Norwood worms, and I could say that that's enough. But for our project, what we wanted to do is take it a step further. We have things that you can do on the farm that you can learn about in the morning and execute in the afternoon, but also things that you can't learn in the morning or in the afternoon. So in the middle are a couple of photographs of direct microscopy, I get that right, microscopy of the soil by someone who's trained in the soil food web system. It comes from Dr. Elaine Ingham. She's a worldwide known person who actually probably coined the term soil food web. Kind of hard to say who exactly did that, but she was definitely one of the first. And this is a direct look at the soil. Who's living there? What proportion are the organisms in? And that's a really great way to see that once we start to change practices, can we literally count the increase in the fungi and the bacteria, the nematodes? Can we see soil food web coming back? But that's not enough either, because that would be almost like preaching to the choir in some regards. Because if we look at the soil in this way, it tells us a lot about the biology, but it's hard to go from the biology to nutrients and how the plants are going to take those up. So we're also utilizing normal conventional soil testing and near infrared soil testing. So we're looking at this from many different perspectives to see, can we see some correlation with practices and outcomes? So if we've got degraded soil, there are many different ways you can go about trying to figure out what the solution would be. You can call yourself this without having a PhD. I am an agroecologist, so I look at things in a different perspective, and that's where I'm drawing my solutions from. But I don't want to take the solutions that we're going to present and put them next to the conventional practices and say that it's a one-for-one swap. This is a different way of looking at the world. And I've used this for a number of years to just demonstrate how we have a wholes within wholes perspective. Systems thinking, holism, each one of these things nests within the next. And we need to have some working knowledge of all the different levels of analysis if we're going to go to the farms that we are managing or that we're consulting on, and we're going to give them options. We need to understand how these different parts relate to one another. So it's also not that just because the hole under your management may be small, maybe you have a small farm, maybe it's only a hectare. Our project is 8,000 square meters, so it's not even a hectare. It doesn't mean that it's not part of the greater system, because the whole is made up of all of these small parts. So it's not just top down, but it's also not just bottom up. We need to understand that it's a complex system. So if we take these nested levels of analysis and we start to think about where we would get ideas from, this is how I like to organize my mind, to say that agroecology is looking at earth systems. How does ecology provide for itself? So this is a 100+ million year story of biological evolution that we are on the edge of. And if we want to operate under sort of looking at what can the nature provide for us. Oh, that was a very Finnish phrase. Yes, I said the nature for the first time. What nature can provide for us, then agroecology is a good way to go about it, because it's taking the understanding that we live within the biosphere first and puts agriculture, it's only about 10, 15,000 years old, in the backseat. It doesn't say that we don't have anything to learn from agriculture, but it puts the ecology front and center. So it's the same with all the rest of these. These are all different things that we need to understand if we're going to come up with a useful set of tools and way of looking at the world. So these are just some of the things that correspond with these different levels of analysis. Now, I use this one all the time too, because it's free and because it helps make my point. If we want to understand how Earth systems work, life on Earth that supports us anyway. So I'm not talking about things that live on depths of the ocean floor that get their, energy from hydrothermic vents, comes from the sun. Where we live in a solar system, remember, nested system, sun comes into Earth, goes to the primary producers. Well, one thing that I like about this diagram is that there's a bit of a hint to one of the big problems or questions that we have, which is the nutrients. So we have the energy, but where's all the other matter and how is that coming into the system? Well, this just hints at recycled nutrients. But in order to recycle something, you have to have it in the first place. You can't recycle a glass bottle unless you've got the glass bottle in your hand. So where are these nutrients that are getting recycled coming from? This is very simplistic, right? We have 30 minutes, but the liquid carbon pathway helps answer this. So the liquid carbon pathway is essentially the primary producers, the plants, sharing the result of their photosynthesis through the roots to biology in the soil. And we have no idea how many species have really lived down there yet. We have some clue as to how they might be distributed, but it's still a black box for the most part, because this is about 10, 15 years that we have good information on the system. So the plants are feeding the soil food web, and those organisms in return, in exchange for the food, are bringing nutrients to the plants. And then that gets recycled through the system. So that's how life on Earth works in one slide. So you can go home and say you learned how life works, all the mysteries of life.
Can I just hold here for a while? You guys on the looking at this from behind your computers, can you see Joshua's presentation as well?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yes,
Right,
we
so
can see.
Thank you.
All right, so let's go from that kind of graphical representation to just using the photograph. So sunlight is entering the ecosystem, and this is a great way to tell if your plants are participating in the liquid carbon pathway in the soil food web. So this is called rhizosheathing. That is, that's my hand, that's my finger. We have a root fragment about this large supporting, or a rhizome supporting roots about, the size of my hand, and you can barely see the roots. It looks like they're covered in dirt. And that's because of the biological glues that are being exuded by the plant, by the bacteria, and by the fungi. And it's indicating that there's an active soil food web formation in the rhizosphere. So rhizo root, rhizosheathing, like a sword, keep your sword in the sheath, because we all do that. And so that's what's happening kind of on an individual basis. If you imagine sun coming in, going to a plant, and if it's in a healthy environment, it's feeding the soil food web. But no organism lives in isolation, right? They live in communities. Ecosystems are diverse communities, and generally speaking, perennial plant communities. So yeah, most places on Earth don't have annual plants growing on them year after year. We're the ones who make that. I'm not saying it's good, not saying it's bad, but that's just, you know, evolutionary history in a nutshell, with some nice views of Finland, showing diverse plant communities. So if we take those together and we try to draw some ideas, it's no wonder that you arrive at something called the soil health principles. If you're researching agriculture or horticulture and you're using English as one of your main languages, you've probably come across these three words with the capital letters before. And that's for good reason, because these principles, I won't read them for you because it gets boring to read them. These principles, when put together, can take you to a place of increasing biological activity, to improving the yields, reducing erosion, and getting to biologically mediated fertility, which is really where we want the plants to be, because that's how they evolved. It doesn't mean we won't support the plants with fertilizer if they need it, but the first place we should go to is making sure the plants are exercising their genetic, expression, what they're supposed to be doing first and foremost. So these are really important. And notice one thing though, they don't tell you what to do. None of these principles tell you specifically what to do. And that's why it's a set of ideas, so you can quickly figure out, how do I want to keep my soil covered? These kind of questions. We're going to look at this in a bit more detail soon. You can take this set of principles anywhere that agriculture is practiced on planet Earth, because they're derived from this understanding that we're living in a biosphere that's many millions of years old. Oops, left that one. Increasingly stable yields. That's also really nice. It may not mean that you have more yields, but if they're stable over time and you've reduced your inputs for it as a farmer, that's pretty good. So what this looks like, though, is going to always be unique. So this is from my old farm before I started work here with Novia. This is a agroforestry system in Espoo. It's only about 20 minutes away from our project site. So I put these practices and principles into play before in Finland. I was told it doesn't work in Finland, but I've kind of shown you when you step back that this isn't about Finland. This is about life on Earth, sunlight, plants, biology, ecosystems. So what you see here is not exactly what we're doing, but I wanted to demonstrate that you can put these principles into play in Finland. And yes, it will look differently depending on the context. And that's why we have a whole new project, because I'm in a new context. We're in a new place, and I've got to figure out what it is that we're going to do. We're not going to look at this again, but what we're doing is successional silvo-arable agroforestry. So I have this penchant for giving people a mouthful. This is more than 3 words. This is 2 words and that's 2 words. So it's actually about 5 words put together. And most people, successional, they start thinking about TV shows. So let's take each of these words one for one. Agroforestry is simply the deliberate inclusion of woody plants into agricultural scenarios. It doesn't tell you very much, again, it's very broad, but it means that you've thought about, because the word deliberate, how you want to bring those trees and shrubs back into your cropping system. So our project is primarily an alley cropping system. So it's a silvo-arable system, and it has elements of these ecosystem services built into it as well. You can't just get one outcome when you create an agroforestry system. They're inherently multifunctional, but you can decide what your priority is and how you want to arrange the elements in order to push or pull on any of one of these things. And the last thing that you could probably guess at is that management of these systems matters. Because you can take this exact same plan that I have, if you could do it, and you could, in a parallel universe, port it over into another universe, send somebody else to manage it, but you give them that so-called conventional practices toolkit, and you're going to get vastly different results. Agroforestry does not lead to regenerated soil. And if you need evidence of that, look at California and look at all of the tree crops grown in California with bare soil and all of the water and everything else. It's the management of the system that's the outcome. So the title of this show, the title of this presentation is a little bit of a bait and switch, because it's the principles and the use of diverse plant communities in supporting the biological function that restores the degraded soil. The decision to do an agroforestry system like this, that we're going to show you, is based on context. We're trying to meet the needs of this place with this farmer in this socioeconomic circumstance. So if we move to silvo-arable, here's the current working plan of our project, but you don't need to know what's going on there because you're probably still in the dark with agroforestry and everything else. And because we're going to have to cut out like a 250 square meter swath because of a gas pipeline. So I've simplified it for you. If you're thinking about silvo-arable systems, this is all you need to know. You have the place, you have the field, there's the edge of the field, the margins, you have tree lines. They don't have to be straight, but it's easier to draw them straight on Google Slide. And then you have the space between the tree lines, those are alleys. So you have three places that you can do something with an agroforestry system. Our project is interesting because we're combining in both of these places, in the tree lines and the alleys, existing practices from this farm, as well as practices that I bring with me from my prior farming experience. So here's a picture of some cover crop trials elsewhere on the farm. If you notice that they're done in strips, we're going to be doing strip cropping on this farm. So we actually already have a little bit of this. How do you get the tractor straight up and down the row without running into the next area? We're doing cover cropping, so we're bringing in diverse plant communities for specific functions to restore the soil. So these things are already happening and they're going to take place in the alleys. The word salad comes in with the tree line system. So this is where we're going to be doing successional multi-strata polycultures. Succession meaning they go from one plant community to the next. Multi-strata means multi-layer. And polyculture means that it's not simply one crop. So here's some images from my old farm where I have different, iterations of this, but similar principles. All right, so we're fusing this all together at the Lill-Nägels site. The successional aspect comes into play with the idea that ecosystems change over time. Biology is in relationship with the abiotic forces of the planet, and they actually change their environment through time. And as organisms change their environment through time, other organisms will find a new niche. And the classic way is that you have a progression to a forest. In an agricultural scenario, in an agricultural context, we're thinking more about fields and deliberate inclusion of trees and where you go next after that with adaptive management, that we're not setting our sights that it has to look like this in 100 years. We say that we're going to take it as we come. With our project, though, we're going to narrow the focus and we're going to look at the first few years. All right, these systems take a long time in temperate climates to come all the way to some kind of climax and cycle through. We don't know what they're going to look like. And we would like to keep the space open and grow sun-loving crops. So I've already mentioned that in the sort of field space, in the alleys, that's where we're going to do the strip cropping. So we've narrowed that down to 12-meter alleys. It gives us 4 passes with a planter. That gives many different options for combining them together for different amounts of plants. 12 meters is probably the most narrow you could go in our context, this latitude, this climate, this species selection. And we've done that primarily because it's a pilot project. And we want to put a lot of trees in our field so we can get more information. I mentioned that the multi-strata systems are in the tree lines from that little dude. Ooh, that's not a, no. It comes, so here's a drawing of what it might look like in the first year. Even in the first year, we're bringing in polycultures and biological communities. So the plants have, we'll look at this in more detail, but each tree line has different sections, and we deliberately putting different crops in at those times. So in the first few years, garlic is going to be a cash crop. It comes in 1 yearly cycle. The trees will not produce, reliably large yields until maybe 7 or 8 years down the line. So we need to backfill through time from 8 years to present, how we get some revenue from this system. And so eventually the trees will take over and we'll have an undulating pattern, if I continue with this design, which is going to allow us to mimic more like a savanna type ecosystem. So this is more like a savanna. It's not a closed canopy. We're not going to close canopy with this project. I'm nearing the end. Hopefully I'm not too far over 30 minutes. So what does this look like when we move from design to bringing in the biology? So I'll use the cash crop that we put in the autumn as an example of that. So garlic, I just mentioned, that's our cash crop. We're taking these ideas from market gardening, which is to really focus on the quality and the information that you need to make good decisions in the future. So we don't just take these bags of seed garlic, dump them in a bucket randomly and put them, even nicely space them. But we don't do that because you can get 3 to 4 different size classes from the garlic. The different size cloves. They can be this big, sometimes they can be this big. You put this big next to this size, and there's going to be competition, and there's going to be a very weird variance in your yield. So if you separate those out by size, and you know how much they weighed and how many there are, then you can compare the yield. It's like having a yield monitor, and you can understand what produced what and what I should say for seed garlic. So that's one of the first steps, is to not just simply put the plants in the ground, but to have a plan about how you're going to do it. If you had very keen eyes, you may have noticed from the microscope that there's almost no fungi in this system. We have very little fungi. In agriculture, we usually want at least 1-to-1 ratio biomass, fungal biomass to bacterial biomass. These are still early days. We don't really know, but 1-to-1 from, a few million hectares at this point, coming back with soil analyses, is showing some pretty good results. We don't have them, so we're bringing them back in. This is a commercial inoculant from Czech Republic, and that is going to allow those plants to have their symbiotic partners waiting for them as soon as the roots come out from the bottom of the clove. But is that a plant community? Is that a community? One species of plant and some fungi? No, we need bacteria, we need nematodes, we need all kinds of other things. So we're also using compost extracts and biological stimulants and putting those on the plants. So every single time that I went down the row and put the garlic into the ground, it wasn't just garlic that was being planted. It was a whole community of organisms that as soon as that garlic decides to put out its roots, hopefully you see some rhizosheathing and you see the proliferation of the biology. So that's how even in the cash cropping, we're going to be reintroducing biology into the system. You'll notice what we didn't do, and I didn't talk about, was anything like agricultural lime. So there's no calc being added here. The soil pH is about 5.3, 5.5. The plants, most plants are able to modify the pH in their rhizosphere. They can move the points 1 to 2 points on the pH scale if they have what they need with the soil biology. And this isn't just me talking, it's lots of other people on millions of acres now who aren't recommending lime at all, getting the biology going. It doesn't mean that lime isn't necessary in some cases, but it does mean that, well, if we put lime, we won't be able to test this hypothesis that we have. And then lastly, we're also doing something that the agricultural ministry doesn't like very much, but that's okay because we're experimenting and it's a pilot project. We're bringing in diversity in the woody species. So we have oaks, we have elm, ash, maple, rowan, black elderberry, and a few herbaceous plants that are forming a seed bank down the middle we looked here down the middle in the 50 centimeter center, where those trees and shrubs will germinate. They'll have their biological associates. So now we also are bringing in ectomycorrhizal fungi, which are almost never used in agriculture because the species we associate with food don't need them. So they don't exist and we don't get their benefits. So oaks, for example, are highly ectomycorrhizal, and they will form a new and different mycorrhizal network in the soil, which will help open up the pore spaces, create soil aggregates, and start to exchange for photosynthesis nutrients with the plants. You might wonder why you'd put oak trees since they can grow 30 meters tall, about almost 30 meters wide. It's because you need to reframe these plants as a plant community that are in service of the tree crops, which I kind of skipped out on, so I only have 30 minutes. Because one species of plant can't intercept all of the sunlight coming into the system. That's why we have weeds. If you plant a huge monoculture of wheat, and that's all you have, there's all these other niches, ecological niches available for other plants to use. And why would they not use them? Especially if they have available nutrients and you've done some tillage and you've warmed things up for them. So these plants are coming in here to deliberately fill the niches that are available. And then they will be managed to produce biomass and growth hormones in the soil. So if you've heard about coppicing or pollarding, so it's this deliberate cutting of trees at different places on their trunks in order to get resprouts. Plants that have been cut in the winter in our environment can have 30 or 40% more photosynthesis taking place the next year across the whole field than if they were left uncut. So it's applied disturbance. It's a really interesting thing. There's a lot of debate about what's really going on, but it seems to function. So we're testing it. And then that's it for me. There's more stuff coming on the website, and you can contact me whichever way you want. Probably not by phone is the best. I'm not that old, but I'm also pretty young. I like getting emails, but we can arrange a call. We can arrange a call. I just found out that apparently I practice monk mode because I don't look at my phone every 5 minutes. So Silicon Valley life hacks. Pay attention to your work. So that's it. Hopefully I'm not too far over time. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I think I already saw some questions there in the chat. But it's also okay for those of you who are there behind your computers to raise your hand, but wait for Heidi to give you to say it's your turn if you want to ask questions yourself. That's perfectly okay. But are there any questions in this room right now? Otherwise, we just take the ones that are there in the chat. Okay, let's go with the ones in the chat.
There are two questions. Number one, could you please repeat the research questions and hypothesis proposed?
Well, we don't exactly have research questions, but if I can reframe what we're doing, the objectives as questions, the most simple way to say it is, can farmer-supported biodiversity improve soil fertility? I think that's the shortest that I can possibly make it. So can farmers support biodiversity and increase soil fertility? What was the second part of the question?
Hypothesis proposed.
So I guess the hypothesis is that yes, they can.
Second question, what are the metrics used for measuring the success of the project?
Well, depends on which part of the project you want to look at. So from the farmer's perspective, the success is going to be whether or not, once you exclude the soil analysis and things that take part in the project itself as a pilot project, but whether or not the time invested in setting up the system and the materials that we bring into play, the work involved, whether all of that is going to be a profitable micro farm enterprise. So this is very interesting in that we have 8,000 square meters but we haven't designed it like we only have 8,000 square meters. There's a question about garlic that popped up. I'll answer that later, but we only wanted to simplify the kind of cash crops in the system. We could have grown another 30 plus different species. We could have transferred a whole lot of stuff over from Lill-Club, but we deliberately simplified it. So we're going to see if we can make this into a profitable little system that moves from one cash crop to the next. The other metrics are going to be, well, kind of a constellation of soil health related metrics, like improved water infiltration rates, improved soil organic matter, all from this baseline, right? So we established a baseline last year, and then this spring we'll be taking samples again, because we'll be taking samples 3 times per year. And over time, what we're hoping to see is an improvement in the soil organic matter, in the availability of the nutrients that are there, and maybe even a change in the pH. That would be also very interesting. I'm not totally expecting it, but it might happen. Right, so, it's a constellation of things, because soil health can't be boiled down to one metric. But one of the best ones is water infiltration rate, to be honest. If we can get really good water infiltration rates, that's a really great metric.
Yep.
There was one question about garlic. Why was garlic chosen as the cash crop?
So garlic was chosen as the cash crop because it carries its value well after harvest time. So finished garlic, especially garlic that is not grown with chemical pesticides or with artificial fertilizers. Our project is not certified organic, so we're not saying it's organic, but so without those things, garlic brings anywhere from 20 to even, I've seen 30 euros a kilo on the market for direct sale to customers. It's a pretty high price for a vegetable, especially when you can get it for 4 or 5 from Spain and organic from Spain even. So it has a lot of value, and it doesn't lose that value over time. So people are happy to pay for a fresh bulb the same that they're going to pay 6 months later if you still have it and you want to sell it through the winter. And then you don't need specialized storage equipment necessarily at this scale. So we're not talking about tons of garlic. We're talking about a few hundred kilos per year. Then this farm can sit on that value for a while. It grows in an upright fashion, so it allows for intercropping, and it's really easy to weed around. It doesn't get eaten by slugs and snails. At least I haven't ever seen it get eaten by slugs and snails. And that's a big challenge because we don't want to invest time and effort picking off slugs and snails in our silvo-arable system. This is not what we're trying to do. So it scales a bit. And then if it works and there's a growing interest, there are mechanization that can be brought to play in terms of the planting and even the harvest of garlic. So it's one that scales in a few different directions. And basically, it's the market that decides. Like, people really want it, and it almost always sells out, and we never have enough local production. So at this point in time, it just makes sense to grow garlic.
Yeah. Thank you. Was there any question here? Maybe Otto.
Thank you. Very pleasant and very enjoyable presentation. Not a show, a presentation, but it was as a show. So thank you. It was a pleasure to listen. I have many questions, but I have to restrain. I have to catch the train bus. So I have to I will skip the chemical part because you then mentioned very many interesting aspects, pH and near-infrared analysis and things like this. But I was thinking this agroforestry is quite a new thing for me. And you actually mentioned this water filtration. And I was trying to address, because when you look at the typical Finnish field for harvesting or for crops, you have this draining with the ditches. In Finland, we are very good in digging ditches, if you haven't noticed. But this is a fully different approach. So the water adjustment levels are done by natural utilization, like when you have this bigger trees and you restrain the water and keep the balance in the ground in a totally different way. So have you found how your experience, because you apparently have experience, how well is that working? Because you started this very dry field in the beginning, so let's hope for a better result.
We have irrigation.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
Do you have any comments?
Well, that's one of the main hypotheses for in favor of agroforestry is that it should help with soil water dynamics. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it will make tile drainage, unnecessary, but we would hope so. I don't think anybody really likes tile drainage. I think they like what happens after they do it, but I'm not sure that they like the expense and everything else that comes with it. So the trees in this system will hopefully improve the soil water infiltration as we move it from this perennial grass back into annual cropping in these alleys. So in these alleys, we won't have any more perennials. We're going to try to get rid of all the perennials. And then we might even have some surface erosion if we don't do it well. And then that'll hit the tree beds, which have that compost right now, but then in the future should have a litter layer that is either made in place or brought in from some of the cover cropping we'll do in the margins. So if there's any surface water, then it's going to slowly absorb and follow the roots down. The larger the trees, but then the further away you need to go in order to grow these annual crops. So it's one of these things where agroforestry is a huge topic and it depends on what system is looked at. But I think that it does play a pretty big role in water management, especially with key line design. So instead of having straight lines in the field, you have the system that moves water from the valleys towards the ridges. And that's if you have a lot of surface runoff. So we'll see, but there's a problem. The one problem is that tree roots like tile drainage. Right, so there'll need to be a lot more research on how close you can get in different soils because they can run 20, 30 meters away. They know where the water is eventually and they'll clog up the ditches. So in Finland, we'll have to see. You would hope though that in concert, right? So the agroforestry system that we're doing is not just the trees, but it's the alleys and the sort of organic no-till approach with regenerative soil health principles. That as we improve the water holding capacity and utilization of the water that's there, that the tile drainage hopefully is going to not really have much of a job in the future. That would be the hope. I would hope that it doesn't need a job. It's a long-winded way of saying that we don't know yet, but there's indications from elsewhere that it should help. I understand. I usually have to go with the same one.
Yeah, okay. I have one question from you and then one from Patricia. Hugo's question is, how are farmers aware of this issue? Are they happy to cooperate?
With agroforestry in general, that's a good question. And I hope that someone in this room who is a student might be interested in it because at the moment, you can probably tell people who like agroforestry, we tend to like it. And so we can see some of the problems with agroforestry and why farmers might not have a positive attitude towards it, but we are full of our own biases. And there hasn't been, for example, like a nationwide survey of farmer attitudes or even attitudes of those in government about agroforestry. So admitting that I have a lot of biases, I think that in general, farmers they're not unaware of agroforestry because agroforestry has a long history in Finland, especially with animals in woodland pastures. And also now we continue to do these traditional biotopes being maintained with animals. So that's a form of silvopasture. But in terms of bringing the trees back into the alleys, back into the actual fields, I think that most people put their hands up and say, I'm not really interested in that right now. So our pilot projects, I think people are interested. They want to see because it took generations to remove the trees, create fields, keep the trees out of the fields. And then now you have a whole new generation of people coming in saying, no, come, let's stick trees back in your fields. But there's this conservative element And I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's understandable that this was a massive investment to get rid of these trees. And you better have a really good reason to bring these trees back into my fields, especially if I won't get subsidies for them and no one can tell me how to do it. So I don't have a great answer for you. I think that there's a growing interest, but I think that there is a real big dose of skepticism because Finland's covered in trees. It's not like Ireland or parts of France or Spain or somewhere else where the benefits can be, brought about very quickly by reforesting. Even 10% of your farmland is going to get huge amounts of benefits. Whereas in Finland, we're going to have to kind of struggle, I think, sometimes to parse out the benefits, which is, and I'm not answering your question anymore, I'm going off on a tangent, which is why we've built in the desired profitability of the system from the beginning. So we're not relying just upon ecosystem services. We want this system to pay for itself. So hopefully it can get replicated on another hectare or 5 hectares, right? So that it restarts like a positive economic engine on the farm, which I didn't really have time to get into, but that's.
We have a couple of questions from Patricia. She's going to ask them herself, and then one from Pyry. Patricia.
Hello there. What an inspiring presentation. I'm really excited about this, and I hope to talk more to you. But I had a question about, because now you're showing a case of where you start from scratch, but I work quite a lot with, for instance, orchards where they are looking at the possibility to start bringing in the more agroforestry elements, or let's say agroecological elements, into their production to diverse it. And what's your view on that? Is that how much have you seen of that, and what kind of barriers do you see in connection to that? And do you think that there are opportunities to take it from sort of conventional and go and sort of enriching it more with patterns that way?
Oh, great. That's a great set of questions. It's interesting. This farm has an apple orchard, a conventional apple orchard on it. It's rather young. This section of it is, but they've had an orchard for a while. And so we also have a lot of input from an orchardist, someone who grows apple trees for a living, looking at this and finding the problem. So if I could put it this way, I think that the smartest thing to do is to step back and get that holistic perspective of the farm as an agroecosystem and the farm as an economic unit, and identify everything in terms of the budget and the goals and the lifestyle that the farmer wants to have before considering altering the orchard. Because I'm the first one to admit that taking apple trees or some other kind of tree and then putting black currants, strawberries, or cold hardy grapes in between the trees is going to cause a lot of headaches, and that's why it's a pilot project. And there's a lot of information from farmers, especially in North America, who are adapting those soil health principles in orchards. So they maintain highly intensive plantings of monoculture apple trees, but they change the diversity in the understory. And then they're starting to see really great benefits for those monocultures. So I'm not even totally sure yet myself if this polyculture in the same row makes sense. But I do think that there's a lot to be said about altering the tree lines or the orchard lines and getting new species in there. And so spreading out the diversity, not in a linear fashion, but over the whole orchard space. And I think that that is a place where we might see, it's the bridge in some ways to this full-on polyculture. So if you have a few rows, a few sections of the orchard that are just not performing very well and you need to put new trees in, that's a great opportunity to try something new. But I think I would be one of the first to say that I would never recommend like changing an existing system that dramatically. That's just me. There are people who've done it. So, and then barriers, labor. So this kind of system is going to be highly based on increasing the profit margin of what we produce by bringing in the community supported agriculture aspect. So the CSA members will ideally be harvesting the vast majority of the food. Obviously not the wheat. If we grow, when we bring wheat back in, I'm not going to give somebody a sickle, but from the tree lines, you know, so we won't be paying that labor, and that handling of berries and fruit is very expensive. So it's the integration of the community into the harvesting model that will help. So one of the biggest drawbacks that most farmers can see to this kind of system is that how do you mechanize the pruning and the organization of the biomass, which then leads to the next question in our environment, which are, you know, rodents. And you know, are you creating habitat for rodents that are going to attack your trees over the winter? So there are a lot of questions to be had still, but I think that there's a big signal that this works. People are doing it. So we just have to try it, but not try it so it sinks anybody's farm. I mean, that does happen. You know, sometimes people do go overboard and they go all in on a new idea and then they wind up in a bad place. So that's not what I'm hoping to project.
Did we still have?
Yes.
Okay.
We have a question from Piri.
All right. I think Finnish farmers are quite good at imagining different problems that might arise if they start doing something new, and we need more very open and realistic examples of how things can be done, and for that I would like to ask if how much are you going to document and share this information that you are gathering from this project
Well, it's all
to the
going to be.
farmers and the community?
Mhm. Well, we try to put everything out that we possibly can that wouldn't have some kind of privacy issue related to it, right? So the website that is still under development has a lot of information. So I've documented the whole design process from the site analysis to the design and gotten into why we've chosen what we've chosen. And there's even more coming to talk about the management. When it comes to the economic standpoint, we are documenting the labor hours that go into it. So using a mobile timesheet app with tagging in order to track, well, how long did it take to weed this with these tools in these circumstances? And then we can put all of that into a spreadsheet in order to figure out what the actual labor costs would be versus what we projected. Whether or not the farmer is going to want to share exactly how many CSA shares get sold is another question, but you will be able to go on the website that he will launch for the CSA, and you'll be able to see what the pricing is, and you'll be able to piece together a pretty good picture if we don't wind up sharing that information. I think that we probably will, but you know, I can't speak for the farmer. It's his garlic. At the end of the day, it'll be his business to share with. But I think that it's very important to share all of this. I agree with you. And that's a black box that we're hoping to open up with this project a little bit, because we have the opportunity as a pilot project to really document it and then share it, hopefully in a format that's interesting as well, as not just going to dump it out there and let it be, but also present it and keep it on, you know, publicly available on the website. So yeah, we're sharing everything. You can find even the soil reports. You know, the last thing I'll say is if you want to see what the lab sent us, you know, go to the website. There's the link. You can get the PDF and you can look for yourself, and then you can check what I wrote, and you can disagree or not, but it's all there.
Sounds good. There is another barrier, I think, in farmer personalities, that most of the farmers are not kind of up to new things, and then the like the marketing side and development or even just trying new plants or things like that. Are you planning to take up some practices that would be easier for normal Finnish farmers to pick up?
That's a very good question. Yeah, well, yes and no. Yes and no. So yes, it's convenient that I still have this up here. The kind of information that will be immediately transferable to the vast majority of the fields that people are cultivating is what's happening in the alleys. So as much as the topic is agroforestry, and then we kind of just stare at what's going on with the trees, you know, the vast majority of the site is actually alley cropping. And since that's going to be based on annuals and on using mechanization, that if we start to see in 2 or 3 years that these sort of organic no-till package is working, that kind of thing is immediately transferable to anybody else who wants to take that package and start to implement it on their farm. So that's something that is immediately scalable. And it's also the thing that's the least piloty, as I like to call it. It's the least experimental. What we're putting into practice is an experiment for Finland, for southern Finland, but the practices and principles are in play on millions of hectares at this point. And we know that they generally work if you can figure out your system. When it comes to the trees, though, well, the kind of crops that we're focused on are berries and fruits, and then probably also some herbs and cut flowers. That is totally context specific because we're in Kirkkonummi. We're 25 minutes away from, you know, over 1 million people. So we have the opportunity to expand the number of crops that make sense for us. And it's a lot harder to sort of take which species you would put into the tree lines and make that available to someone who either isn't in a situation where it makes sense to direct market those things, or that they don't have an interest in growing them. So, you know, that part farmers are just gonna have to be open to growing new things. But these principles can also probably be scaled to biomass production, right? So if somebody wants to get into bioenergy or something like this, there are a lot of different ways that you can take it. So some is immediately applicable, some is not, and we'll just have to see. The last thing I want to say, though, is that in the farmers that we immediately reach with the farmers we immediately reach with these so-called higher value marketable crops that we can integrate into the system that we've designed, there's an opportunity here for other people to get involved in farms, because this is only taking, not in this scenario here, but on our actual project, we're actually only taking around 10% of the field and putting it into trees. But that 10% in this context is the same size that I was farming at Lill-Club. So I have the same number of square meters available to me as I did in my market garden. Depending on the circumstances and what people want to do, you could take this to say 5 hectares, and you could probably be producing 60, 70, or even 100,000 euros in vegetables on 10% of a farmer's land. And that could be a whole nother enterprise that's not even run by the farmer themselves. And then they get the ancillary benefits of rent, the ecosystem services, the exposure, all of that kind of thing. So that's also the social side of this project that I didn't have time to get into, was how agroforestry is an opportunity for farmers to bring new interested people, new blood into the farming community. Is that, look, like, we're looking at our fields in a whole new way. There's economic opportunity here, and we hopefully can even do it on degraded soil.
Yeah, thank you. We're almost at 4 o'clock, but there was still one comment there in the chat.
Yes, you read it.
Yeah.
It is highly advised against the farmer changing his practices overnight. The transition must be done as learning goes on and by trial and error. Margin for error to get busted is too high.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not, I don't recommend anybody changes overnight.
Good.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Thanks for your nice presentation. I have a question. Is it suitable for other countries or exclusive for Finland? Perhaps the characteristics of soil, are different in different areas. So do you think what's the factors and what factors or elements do you think is important for implementing this project?
Oh, well, I'm gonna actually spotlight somebody else's work that she just shared today. So there's a master's student in the Netherlands who just posted her master's thesis, which is on successional agroforestry. And she's created a framework to walk through the design process attached to a database of over 200 species adapted to Mediterranean and temperate climates that are going to 13 different specific functions that you should design into the system. And it can help farmers walk through the whole thing. So we can take these patterns and principles elsewhere. Finland is probably one of the least likely areas for agroforestry to start taking place. The further south in general, the further south you go, the more applicable agroforestry is, because they grow faster, species selection is wider, and essentially we need the protection from the sun. So, for example, in tropical climates, they don't put 12 meters necessarily, depends on the site, but they don't put 14 meters between the alleys. Their alleys might even be 6 meters. And they might close the canopy of the whole system within 3 or 4 years. And then 20 years later, they can open the system back up if they want to. So we're actually really underdeveloped. So if you look up successional agroforestry or subtropic agriculture, or just agroforestry in general, it is being implemented much more rapidly in other climates. It's our context where we need to be more hesitant for a lot of different reasons. But it's a great question. It's super applicable elsewhere. And it's so applicable that you would even, in the tropics, you wouldn't be north-south orientation. You would even turn your tree lines east-west because you want the shade. So weird for anybody in Finland.
Yeah.
Like, I want the shade, but you know, Spain and Italy are even looking at that. They need the shade now at this point. Yeah.
Thanks so much. We're already a little bit over time, so I'm gonna thank all of the listeners there in front of their computers and also here in this room. Thank you so much. And a big warm thank you to Joshua. I hope that in a few months' time, when this field season is over, you'll be here to tell us more. Perhaps about the CSA.
That's right. Thank you, everybody. And yeah, please, if you have any interest, try to follow us. I update the website pretty regularly. We should have more information coming, and field visits will start at the end of May. And we'll have a lot of field visits, and then there'll be another seminar in the autumn. Yes. So hopefully we'll have more than hypotheses.
Yeah.
And we'll have some preliminary results.
Good. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.